I still remember the precise weight of the air in that room, heavy and sticky with the arrogance of people who believed they had already won. The boardroom table was polished to a shine, the walls covered with projections of charts, forecasts, and glossy slides meant to impress investors who had no idea what was truly happening beneath the surface. I had walked into that meeting expecting it to be the next step toward everything I had dreamed of. Years of sacrifice finally paying off, our startup moving from fragile beginnings to a place of undeniable strength, our vision validated by the kind of funding that could push us into the future. I had built that vision brick by brick, often with my own hands, through late nights and broken promises to myself about rest and balance. And yet, the moment I sat down and saw the look on my fiancé's face, I knew something was wrong. It wasn't the kind of smile he gave me when we used to talk about our first idea on the floor of my old apartment, dreaming of how we'd change the industry. This smile was rehearsed, practiced, almost cruel in its neatness. It was the smile of someone who wanted to hurt, but to do it elegantly, under the guise of professionalism. My best friend sat next to him, and the instant I caught her eyes, I knew. I knew because she looked away too quickly, because the air between us, once natural and unbreakable, now pulsed with guilt disguised as composure. The meeting began with the usual pleasantries, the kind that mean nothing but fill space. And then he spoke. My fiancé, the man I had trusted not only with my heart, but with the very core of my future, leaned forward, as if to deliver news that would change my life. "You're out," he said, the words sharp and precise, landing like blades. There was no hesitation, no attempt to soften the blow, only a cold efficiency that told me he had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in his mind. He turned slightly, resting his hand on the shoulder of the woman who used to share secrets with me late into the night, the woman I once believed would defend me against the world. "Your best friend will take your place here," he continued, voice calm, almost gentle in its cruelty. "This startup is ours now, and you'll get nothing." The silence that followed was deafening, but it wasn't empathy. It was the charged silence of investors processing what they thought was a victory, a strategic move that cut out the dead weight and replaced it with someone they now saw as more loyal, more aligned with their interests. Then, as if on cue, the applause began. They clapped for him, for her, for this union of betrayal that they mistook for strength. Their cheers echoed in the room, a chorus of blind approval that turned my humiliation into a spectacle. I sat there, still, as if rooted to the chair, watching the scene unfold with an outward calm that none of them expected. They thought I was broken, devastated, watching my entire future crumble before my eyes. They thought I would fight, or cry, or beg, but I did none of those things. I simply sat back, folded my hands neatly, and smiled. Because what none of them knew, not my fiancé with his rehearsed arrogance, nor my best friend with her false composure, not the investors who cheered as if they had just witnessed the birth of something unstoppable, was that this was only the beginning of a story they could not control. They thought they had pushed me out, cut me cleanly from the body of the company I had nurtured with my blood and sleepless nights. But in reality, they had just set into motion the quiet ticking of a clock, whose alarm would shatter their entire illusion. They believed they had stripped me of everything, but I knew something they didn't, that their victory was already hollow, that behind their confidence, there was a crack waiting to widen. I let them bask in their triumph, let them mistake my silence for defeat, because silence was the sharpest weapon I had in that moment. My mind replayed every sleepless night I had endured to design our product, every sacrifice I had made to pitch to investors, every personal dream I had set aside so that he could pretend to be the visionary. My best friend, now sitting in my place, had once encouraged me through those nights, promising me loyalty, promising me friendship beyond ambition. To see her now, leaning into the spotlight that was meant for me, was a cut deeper than I had thought possible. Yet even as my chest tightened with the weight of betrayal, there was no panic in me, only a cold, focused clarity. They believed I was finished, and the beauty of it was that their belief was exactly what would undo them. In that boardroom, on that day, my life fractured. The personal and the professional broke apart in one clean strike, orchestrated by the two people I had loved and trusted the most. But I did not scream. I did not beg. I did not let them see the storm inside me. I smiled, and in that smile was a secret none of them could decipher. It was the smile of someone who already knew how this story would end, and it would not be with me broken. It would be with them destroyed. This was the meeting that changed everything, not because it ended my role in the company, but because it awakened a version of myself that they had underestimated for too long, the one who no longer played by their rules, the one who would rewrite the ending. And as their cheers echoed, and as my fiancé and my best friend celebrated their victory, I thought only of the quiet deal I had set in motion long before this betrayal, a deal they had overlooked, ignored, or dismissed as meaningless, a deal that, in a matter of time, would turn their triumph into ashes. When I walked out of that boardroom, I carried no visible scars, no tears streaking my face, no trembling in my hands, but inside me there was a storm gathering weight. It would have been easier, perhaps, if betrayal were something clean, if it arrived suddenly and left you bleeding in a way that everyone could see. But betrayal never works like that. It creeps in quietly, hiding in the small cracks of trust you never thought to guard, and by the time it reveals itself, the wound is already deep, carved by years you cannot take back. As I stood in the hallway outside the glass doors where laughter and champagne now flowed in celebration of my removal, I thought of everything I had given to that company, to that relationship, to the dream that had once been shared, but now lay twisted in their hands. And the truth of it was suffocating. They had not only stolen my work, they had stolen years of my life. I remembered the beginning, when it was just an idea scratched on napkins in cheap coffee shops, when my fiancé was still just a man with charm and ambition, but no foundation to build on. I had the skills, the discipline, the sleepless drive that could turn vague dreams into something tangible. I poured myself into it because I believed not only in the idea, but in him, in us, in the possibility that our love could create something lasting and meaningful beyond ourselves. I sacrificed promotions, turned down stable jobs with safe salaries, alienated family who told me I was making a mistake by betting everything on something so uncertain. Nights blurred into mornings as I coded, drafted, wrote, and planned, while he pitched our story to anyone who would listen, wearing the suit of the visionary, while I built the skeleton of what he promised. My best friend was there too, at the start. She cheered me on, brought coffee, stayed late to help me review documents, told me again and again that I was the heart of the whole thing. It is cruel now to think of how she must have been rehearsing her betrayal even as she encouraged me. But in those years, I trusted her like a sister. She was the one who knew how exhausted I was, who saw me fall asleep at the desk with spreadsheets still glowing on the screen, who knew I was the one holding the structure together when everything threatened to collapse. And my fiancé, no, the man I thought was my partner, was the one who told me, with his hand on mine, that someday all this work would be worth it, that I would be proud of what we built together. Those words were currency I spent freely, because I wanted to believe. I let them buy my loyalty, my sleepless nights, my youth disappearing into the glow of laptop screens and endless strategy meetings. There were times I thought of quitting, times when the weight was too much, when the lack of stability threatened to break me. But every time, I told myself it was for us, for the dream, for the future, for the life we would live once the startup was thriving. I thought of the house we would buy, the family we would raise, the story we would tell our children of how we built something from nothing. And so I stayed. I endured. I gave, even when money was scarce, and I used what little savings I had to cover rent for our tiny office space. Even when I skipped meals to stretch budgets, even when my health faltered from exhaustion, I told myself it was temporary, that one day it would pay off. And it did, just not for me. Not in the way I had been promised. That boardroom meeting was proof. All my sacrifices had been collected and handed to someone else, as if the years of sweat and time were nothing more than disposable fuel to power someone else's triumph. To watch them smile, to watch the investors clap, as though my erasure was the best possible move for the company, was like being told that my existence in that entire journey had been unnecessary, that I was nothing more than scaffolding torn down once the building was complete. But I knew the truth, and the truth was that they could not even stand without me. They had built their victory on the bones of my sacrifice, but I knew the foundation was already poisoned. In those hours after the meeting, I replayed everything. The birthdays I had missed because I was too deep in research, the friendships that faded because I no longer had time for them, the vacations I never took, the endless compromises I made so that this vision could survive, and above all, the love I had invested, not just in the man who betrayed me, but in the belief that loyalty and hard work would be enough to secure my place. The weight of that realization pressed hard on my chest. I had wasted years on people who only saw me as useful until they no longer needed me. Yet even in that crushing moment, a strange calm began to grow. Because if those years had been wasted on them, they were not wasted on me. I had learned, I had planned, and most importantly, I had secured my own safety in ways they could not even imagine. They thought they had stripped me of everything, but the irony was that all those sacrifices they dismissed had given me the knowledge, the connections, and the foresight to protect myself. They had underestimated me because I had always been quiet, the one in the background doing the work. They mistook humility for weakness, loyalty for blindness, love for naivete, and in doing so, they set themselves up for the greatest lesson of their lives. The years I had given were not free. They were the down payment for a reckoning they could not escape. As I stood in my apartment that night, surrounded by stacks of documents, contracts, and files that bore my fingerprints more than theirs, I knew the betrayal had not destroyed me. It had only clarified what was at stake. The pain of wasted years was real, but the truth was sharper. Nothing they had built could survive without me, because I had designed the terms of its survival. They thought I had given everything away for free. They would learn soon enough that nothing in this world comes without a cost. The words themselves were simple. 4 syllables, 2 short declarations joined by a venomous pause. But the way he delivered them turned them into something unforgettable, something that would etch itself into the marrow of my memory. "You're out." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The calm precision of the statement, spoken in front of an audience of investors and advisors who looked at him like he was some visionary, untouchable force, carried more power than any shouted tirade could have. And yet, it wasn't the words that cut deepest. It was the smile that accompanied them. That calculated curve of his mouth, rehearsed to appear confident but not cruel, assured but not arrogant, as though he believed himself to be above pettiness, even as he dismantled my place in the company I had built with my own blood and years. That smile was worse than any open display of hatred because it was hollow, and in its emptiness lived every false promise, every whispered reassurance, every time he had held my hand in the past and told me we were in this together. That smile told me all of it had been a performance, a mask he wore until the moment it no longer served him. He leaned back after saying it, his hand casually resting on the shoulder of the woman who had once been my best friend, as if to punctuate the declaration. She mirrored his smile, softer, tinged with something that tried to look like professionalism but reeked of stolen triumph. The investors glanced between them, nodding approvingly, murmurs of satisfaction filling the air like static. They thought they had just witnessed an evolution, the shedding of what they believed to be dead weight, the crowning of a new partnership more aligned with their interests. None of them cared to remember who had been the one pushing the late nights, who had been the backbone of the product, who had sacrificed health and stability to get the company to this room. In their eyes, I was dispensable, a minor character in a grand narrative they believed belonged to him. The cruelty of that moment wasn't in the expulsion itself, because I had already sensed it coming. Betrayal rarely strikes without warning. It whispers before it screams. The cruelty was in how choreographed it all was, how he had chosen to make it a spectacle. He could have dismissed me quietly, behind closed doors, with legal documents and hollow apologies. But instead he waited for the investors to be present, for the advisors to watch, for the cameras capturing pieces of the meeting to record it. He wanted my humiliation to be public, my absence to be explained as a weakness of mine rather than the theft of his. He wanted to stage my downfall like a play, one where he emerged the hero who had carried the company into its future, despite the so-called dead weight of the woman who had been there from the beginning. I remember the air in the room shifting. the momentary silence after his announcement, the anticipation of how I might react. They expected tears, perhaps a trembling voice trying to argue, maybe even anger spilling into raised tones. They expected me to fight for my place, to beg, to reveal myself as desperate, but I gave them none of that. Instead, I allowed myself the smallest of smiles, one that mirrored his but meant something entirely different. His smile was arrogance. Mine was a secret. His smile was a mask for triumph. Mine was the veil of patience, the acknowledgement of a truth none of them knew yet. In that silence, I could feel their confusion, as though my calmness unnerved them more than any outburst could have. And in a way, it did. He glanced at me with a flicker of something uncertain before composing himself again, mistaking my serenity for shock rather than calculation. It wasn't just my fiancé who betrayed me. It was the woman sitting beside him, the woman who had once sworn she would never let anyone come between us. My best friend, if that title even belonged to her anymore, looked at me with a strange mix of pride and guilt, as if she wanted to convince herself that this betrayal was justified, that stepping into my role was destiny rather than treachery. She held his hand like a trophy, like a prize for her loyalty to him rather than to me. To see the two of them together, united against me, was a dissonance I could barely process in that moment. They thought they had me cornered, stripped of all power, erased from the story we had once been writing together. But in reality, they had just set themselves on a path they could not survive. The investors applauded. Their clapping echoed in the glass walls of the boardroom, a sound that rang like mockery in my ears. They applauded not just my removal, but his supposed brilliance, their belief that he had been strong enough to sever ties with weakness and replace it with strength. They had no idea that what they were celebrating was the very beginning of their ruin. I let them clap. I let him smile. I let her bask in the glow of her stolen role. Because silence was more powerful than words in that moment, and I wanted them all to believe they had won. When the meeting ended, I rose from my seat with unhurried grace, as if their performance hadn't touched me at all. I gathered my papers, not because I needed them, but because the act of leaving calmly would sting more than any protest. They watched me with a mix of triumph and curiosity, waiting for a crack, a sign that I was breaking, but I gave them nothing. My smile remained steady, my steps measured, my silence intact. What they did not know was that beneath that stillness lay the weight of every sacrifice I had made, every hour of work they had dismissed, every secret they had overlooked, and most of all, beneath that stillness lay the knowledge of the deal I had put in place long before they decided to cut me out. That smile of betrayal, his smug declaration, their applause, all of it would become meaningless in the days to come. For now, it was their moment, and I allowed them to believe in it fully. But the truth is that moments of triumph built on lies are the most fragile of all, and the higher they lifted themselves on the scaffolding of their betrayal, the harder they would fall when the foundation collapsed beneath them. I walked out of that room knowing that collapse was inevitable, and when it came, it would not be me who broke. It would be them. There was a time when her face meant comfort to me, when seeing her walk into a room was a relief, because it meant I didn't have to carry the weight alone. We had known each other long before the company existed, before the first spark of the idea even left my notebook, before my fiancé became my fiancé. She had been there in the fragments of my youth, laughing with me about dreams that felt impossible, holding me through heartbreaks that seemed endless, telling me in those long nights of doubt that I was capable of more than I ever gave myself credit for. She had been my mirror, the one who reflected back my strength when I couldn't see it myself. To think of her now as the one sitting in my chair, taking my place as though it were something she had earned, is a dissonance I still struggle to accept. But betrayal always cuts deepest when it comes from those who knew you best, those who memorized your fears and turned them into weapons. She wasn't just another woman stepping into my role. She was the woman who knew every crack in my armor. She knew the nights I doubted myself, the times I almost walked away because I couldn't bear the exhaustion anymore. She knew the exact tone of encouragement I needed to keep going, and she gave it freely because, or so I thought, She wanted me to succeed. I had confided in her about everything, about the sleepless anxiety of dealing with investors who dismissed me because of my gender, about the sacrifices I was making financially to keep the company afloat when no one else seemed willing, about the compromises I made in my personal life to keep the dream alive. She had listened, nodded, poured me coffee, reminded me I was stronger than the obstacles, and now I see that every word I spoke was ammunition she tucked away for later. Ammunition she would use not to help me, but to replace me. I can picture the way she must have rationalized it to herself. Maybe she told herself that business is business, that she was simply stepping into a role I had already exhausted myself to maintain, that she was stronger, fresher, better suited to the fight ahead. Maybe she told herself that my fiancé's attention wasn't really betrayal, that love can shift, that I had clung too tightly to something that was destined to slip through my fingers. But none of those rationalizations matter, because at the core of it, she made a choice, to stand beside him rather than me, to turn her loyalty into currency she could trade for power. And the most painful truth of all was that she didn't need to fight me for it. I handed her the map to my downfall when I let her into every corner of my trust. Watching her in that meeting, seated beside him with her posture polished, her smile rehearsed, her eyes darting only briefly toward mine before settling into the performance of her new role, I felt the strange fracture of time itself. I saw her not just as the traitor she had become, but also as the friend she once was, and the contrast between the two was almost unbearable. This was the same woman who had once cried with me over heartbreaks, who had celebrated birthdays and milestones with me, who had sworn she would always be in my corner. Now, she was my replacement. She had stepped into the space I had carved with my own sacrifices and presented herself as the natural successor. To everyone else, she was the clever new partner. To me, she was a ghost of the past twisted into something unrecognizable. But there was something about her performance that revealed the cracks even then. She tried to look confident, but I could see the stiffness in her shoulders, the slight tremor in her hand as she adjusted the papers before her, the way she avoided eye contact with me for more than a heartbeat. Confidence built on theft is never steady. She wanted desperately to believe she belonged there, but deep down, she must have known she had not earned it, that everything she sat upon was stolen from me. That kind of knowledge eats at a person slowly, a poison that seeps into every triumph. She may have smiled that day, but I knew that smile would not last, because nothing built on betrayal can stand unshaken for long. What none of them knew was that while they celebrated her as my replacement, I had already ensured that her victory would be temporary. The deal I had signed, the clause buried in the structure of our agreements, was not something she understood. She may have known my weaknesses, but she did not know all my strengths. She thought replacing me was as simple as taking my chair, my title, my role in the story. But what she did not realize was that she had stepped into a trap, one that required me to leave for it to spring shut. She thought she had won, that she had secured her place beside him both personally and professionally, but in reality, she had simply walked willingly into the ruin I had prepared. And yet, even knowing all of that, even holding the quiet assurance of their impending collapse, I could not stop the ache that spread through me when I looked at her. Betrayal by a lover is devastating, but betrayal by a friend is corrosive in a different way. It makes you question not just the past, but your own ability to judge character, to trust, to believe in the authenticity of any bond. If she had been capable of this, then what did that say about me, about the blind spots in my loyalty, about the way I had chosen to give my trust so freely? The questions gnawed at me as I sat there, watching her perform the role of my replacement with brittle grace. That was the profile of my new partner. Not a woman who had earned her place, but a woman who had studied me long enough to know how to mimic me. She could imitate my posture, parrot my ideas, wear the skin of the friend I once knew, but she could never truly replace me. And while the investors cheered her on, while my fiancé placed his hand proudly on her shoulder as though she were his new prize, I smiled again, because she wasn't my replacement. She was my pawn, even if she didn't know it yet. When the room erupted into applause, when the sound of hands colliding filled the glass walls like a storm of false celebration, I felt a peculiar stillness bloom inside me, as though everything around me had slowed to a crawl while I remained suspended in my own reality. They thought I was broken in that moment. They thought my silence was shock, My steady face the mask of someone too stunned to fight. My fiancé leaned back in his chair, radiating the smug triumph of a man who believed he had won. My former best friend sat poised, eyes carefully avoiding mine, clinging to the performance of confidence that she thought would cement her as my successor. The investors exchanged approving nods, their mouths moving in words I barely registered, all about vision, strength, progress. None of them noticed the way my hands folded neatly in my lap, not trembling, not clenched, simply resting there in quiet control. It was in that silence, my silence, that I made my decision. It would have been easy to lash out then, to spit venom back at them, to tear apart their lies with the truth I carried. I could have revealed everything in that room, every shady move, every whispered conversation I had overheard, every piece of evidence I had collected over the months when I began to sense something was shifting beneath the surface. I could have shattered their illusion right there, in front of the same investors who cheered for them, and watched the celebration die in their throats. But what would that have given me? A momentary satisfaction, the fleeting victory of seeing their faces crack under the weight of exposure. No, that was too small, too cheap for the betrayal they had dealt me. My silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. It was the patience of someone who had already decided not to fight on their stage, not to play by their rules. As they reveled, I drifted inward, revisiting every sacrifice I had made for them. The countless nights where I had pushed through exhaustion until my vision blurred, the mornings where I had shown up despite illness, the relationships I had let die because the company demanded more from me than anyone else ever had. All of it was piled at their feet now, claimed as theirs, and yet they thought my power ended with their declaration. What they did not know, what I let them believe, was that I had been preparing for this possibility all along. I had felt the tremors of betrayal before the earthquake struck, and unlike them, I planned for the aftermath. So I sat in that silence, and in it, I made a vow to myself. I would not crumble. I would not beg. I would not play the part of the discarded, pitiful woman who had lost everything. Instead, I would turn this humiliation into the sharpest blade I had ever carried. If they thought they had cut me out, they had only trimmed away the surface. Beneath it, I was still deeply woven into the structure they celebrated. And when I chose to pull those threads, everything they thought they controlled would unravel in their hands. My silence was not surrender. It was the moment I activated the coldest version of myself, the one they had never bothered to see. He had always mistaken my quiet nature for passivity, my patience for complacency. He had told me more than once, even in moments meant to be sweet, that I was the calm in his storm, the anchor that kept him steady. He never realized that calmness in me was not the absence of strength, but the containment of it. I wasn't the anchor to his chaos. I was the ocean holding his ship, and when I decided to shift, he would drown. Sitting there, watching him grin at the investors, I realized with startling clarity that the love I had given him had been armor he wore as if it belonged to him, and now that he had stripped it away, he was more exposed than he knew. My best friend, too, thought she had triumphed. She thought her carefully curated imitation of my strengths would carry her through, that sitting in my place was enough to make her me. But there are things that cannot be mimicked, things that come only from living the sacrifice, from bleeding into the foundations of a dream. She had not built anything. She had inherited a performance, and like all performances, it would collapse when the curtain fell. I watched her sip her water with hands that trembled just slightly, and I knew she felt it too, though she wouldn't admit it yet. The knowledge that she had stolen, not earned. In that moment, I decided not to waste my breath. I would not argue my worth to people too blind to see it, nor would I fight for a place in a company that now pulsed with rot. My decision was to leave quietly, to let them bask in their illusion of victory, to let them dance on the stage they had stolen, because I knew something they didn't, that I had already rewritten the script. They thought this was the climax of their triumph, but it was only the prologue to their downfall. The silence they mistook for defeat was the sound of inevitability creeping toward them. As I gathered my notes and slid them into my bag, I felt strangely calm, as though I were stepping into the eye of a storm I had already charted. They watched me, curious, perhaps unsettled by how steady I remained. He smirked, thinking my calmness was shock. She looked down, unable to hold my gaze. The investors whispered, dismissing me already, forgetting me as though I had never been integral. I let them believe. Belief can be more dangerous than doubt, and their belief in their own invincibility would blind them to the warning signs when everything began to unravel. My decision was clear. I would not fight them in this room. I would not fight them on their terms. I would destroy them on mine, with patience, with precision, with the quiet ruthlessness they had never thought I was capable of. That moment of silence was not an ending. It was the beginning of a war they didn't even know had started. And as I walked out of the boardroom with my head held high, I carried not the weight of loss, but the clarity of purpose. They had declared me out. They had replaced me. But I had decided, in that silence, that the game was still mine. They just hadn't realized it yet. The night after the boardroom betrayal, I sat alone in my apartment, surrounded by papers that most people would have dismissed as dull, lifeless documents filled with language too dense to matter. Contracts, addendums, filings, agreements, stacks of them piled on my dining table like silent witnesses to everything I had built. To anyone else, they were boring formalities, the unglamorous side of entrepreneurship that investors skim over and partners ignore. But to me, they were weapons. I had learned long ago that the language buried in the fine print carried more power than the grand speeches in front of cameras. And while my fiancé had been busy shaking hands and charming investors, while my best friend had been rehearsing her smile in front of mirrors, I had been reading, line by line, clause by clause, preparing for the moment I always suspected might come. When we first started the company, he had no patience for paperwork. He brushed it off as tedious, something to delegate, something unworthy of his time. But I had insisted. I had spent nights learning everything about corporate structures, about investor protections, about exit clauses and ownership splits. I told myself it was necessary for us to survive, but in truth, it was also for me. I knew that people change, that power corrupts, that loyalty bends under the weight of ambition. I had trusted him, yes, but trust does not mean blindness. So I crafted safeguards, quietly, carefully, folded into the DNA of the company. Small phrases here, seemingly innocuous sentences there, legal knots that only someone paying true attention would even notice. He had signed them without reading. She hadn't been around back then to know they even existed. And now, as I traced the words with my fingers under the soft light of my lamp, I realized just how blind they both had been. The clause itself was simple in appearance but devastating in execution. In the event that any founding partner was forcibly removed or replaced without due cause, certain financial triggers would activate, redirecting funds, freezing access to accounts, and nullifying specific contracts with third-party vendors who had tied their agreements to me personally. It was the kind of clause that seemed paranoid to anyone confident in loyalty, but to me, it was insurance. At the time, he had laughed when I insisted on it. "You worry too much," he had said, kissing my forehead as if my caution was a charming quirk. He signed it anyway, distracted, already thinking about his next pitch. He didn't even ask for clarification, and that arrogance, that dismissal of my foresight, was the seed of his downfall. Now, with me removed in the most humiliating way possible, the clause was no longer just ink on paper. It was alive. It meant that within days, no, within hours, everything they had stolen would begin to crumble. Contracts with suppliers would vanish. Partnerships would dissolve. Payments would be rerouted in ways they hadn't anticipated. Investors who cheered for them would suddenly find their funds locked, their expected returns frozen, their trust shaken. The brilliance of it was that I didn't need to lift a finger anymore. The trap had been set long before their betrayal. All I had to do was wait. Sitting in that silence, reading over the documents I had once agonized over, I felt a strange calm. Not triumph, not yet. That would come later when I watched their empire collapse. What I felt was clarity, the cold certainty that my sacrifices had not been wasted. Every late night, every anxious hour spent deciphering legal jargon, every choice to prioritize caution over convenience, it was all culminating in this moment. They thought they had outsmarted me, that they had cornered me with their betrayal, but they had never even been playing the same game. The beauty of contracts is that they do not care about charm or betrayal. They do not recognize smiles or alliances. They only care about words, signatures, enforceable truths. And I had woven my protection into those truths like a hidden thread, invisible to those who didn't bother to look. He had overlooked it. She had never even known to search for it. The investors had assumed he was the architect of our structure, never realizing that the foundation was mine. And so they had all cheered as they cut me out, unaware that the very act of cutting me loose had activated the mechanism that would sink them. I thought about his face, the smug certainty when he said, "You're out." I thought about her posture, stiff with forced confidence, trying to look like she belonged in my seat. And I imagined what those faces would look like when the first cracks appeared, when payments didn't arrive, when vendors pulled out, when investors called in panic demanding explanations. I imagined the confusion, the scrambling, the arguments that would erupt between them as they tried to figure out how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. They would blame each other. They would accuse, deny, fight. And all the while, the truth would hang over them like a shadow, that they had never truly replaced me. They had simply removed the one person who understood how everything worked. The clause was not just legal protection. It was justice in its purest form. They had stolen my place, my work, my years, but they could not steal what they didn't understand. And soon, when the system I had built began to collapse under their arrogance, the applause of the investors would be replaced with silence, then with anger, then with abandonment. Their triumph would turn to ashes, and I wouldn't need to say a single word to make it happen. That night, as I closed the folders and stacked the contracts neatly, I realized something important. My revenge didn't require me to scream, to fight, or to reveal anything prematurely. My revenge was already written, signed, sealed, and waiting. All I had to do was let time catch up to their betrayal. And time, I knew, was already on my side. It didn't take long for the first fissures to appear. They never do. Not when arrogance blinds people to the fragility of the structures they stand on. At first, everything seemed to go according to their plan. My fiancé paraded himself in front of the investors with the charm he had polished over years of practice. My former best friend sat beside him with her careful smiles and nods, and the room of men and women who believed themselves to be visionaries applauded the supposed new era of our company. They drank to their success, sent out press releases full of glowing words, and convinced themselves that removing me had been a master stroke. But contracts are patient. They don't strike with fury. They unravel slowly, quietly, until what seemed unshakable begins to collapse under its own weight. And when the unraveling began, the applause turned into whispers. The first sign came in the form of silence from a supplier we had worked with since the beginning, a partner whose loyalty had been secured not by charm or promises, but by a contract tied specifically to me. My replacement didn't understand that loyalty is not transferable like shares in a company. When the invoices went unpaid and shipments stopped arriving, she panicked quietly, masking her confusion with professionalism, hoping no one would notice. But people always notice when the gears stop turning. Investors may not care about the fine print of contracts, but they care deeply about disruption, about numbers that fail to align with projections, about anything that suggests instability. The questions began gently at first. Emails, phone calls, subtle probes in meetings. And then the questions grew sharper. Why weren't products shipping? Why were payments delayed? Why were vendors suddenly backing out of agreements? He tried to cover it with the same easy confidence he always used, telling them it was a temporary snag, a misunderstanding, a simple logistical hiccup. And for a moment, they believed him, because they wanted to. Investors are like gamblers. They cling to hope even when the dice are loaded against them. But hope cannot plug holes in a sinking ship. More suppliers followed. Contracts dissolved. Partnerships evaporated. One by one, the pillars that kept the company standing were pulled away, and no one understood why. They searched for explanations, for someone to blame, but the truth was invisible to them, buried in a clause they had never taken the time to read. I watched from a distance, quietly, almost clinically, as the unraveling spread. It wasn't joy I felt. Not yet. It was something colder, a detached satisfaction in knowing that the structure I had built was doing exactly what it was designed to do. It was a machine of justice, grinding slowly, relentlessly, beyond the control of those who had mocked me as expendable. I didn't need to speak. I didn't need to intervene. The contract was my voice now, and it was louder than any accusation I could have made. The investors began to doubt. Their applause dwindled into tense silence in meetings. Their once bright eyes, lit by the promises he had fed them, dimmed with suspicion. They started to notice the cracks not only in the company, but in the partnership that now stood at its head. They saw her fidget under pressure, saw his charm falter as questions grew sharper, saw the way they snapped at each other in small, unguarded moments. Doubt is contagious, and once it infects a group of investors, it spreads faster than any fire. What struck me most during this phase was how quickly loyalty shifted. These were the same people who had clapped as I was discarded, who had nodded approvingly at the announcement of my replacement, who had raised their glasses to the new partnership. Now, only weeks later, they whispered behind closed doors, wondering if perhaps the decision had been premature, if perhaps they had been fooled by appearances. None of them had spoken a word in my defense when I was cast out, but now that their money was at risk, they began to remember my name. They remembered the stability I had brought, the quiet reliability, the way things had always worked when I was there. And still, I said nothing. I didn't call to remind them of who I was. I didn't reach out to reclaim my place. I let the silence stretch, let their doubts grow unchecked, because I knew that doubt alone would be enough to eat away at the foundation of what he and she had tried to build. Every meeting ended with more questions than answers. Every investor call left them scrambling for explanations they didn't have. And with each passing day, the cracks widened. It is a strange thing to witness the collapse of something you built with your own hands. Stranger still when the collapse brings you not grief, but a cold, precise satisfaction. I had once poured everything into that company. My time, my health, my love. Watching it now as an outsider, I realized that I no longer saw it as mine. It had been stolen, corrupted, poisoned by betrayal. Let it fall. Let it burn. What mattered was not the company itself, but the justice that came with its fall. And that justice was already unfolding, written in the silence of missing shipments, in the panic behind investor smiles, in the cracks that widened each day. The first fissure had appeared, and with it, the illusion they had built was already dying. Doubt had entered the room, and once it enters, it never leaves. Soon, suspicion would become anger. Anger would become abandonment, and abandonment would become ruin. I didn't need to push. I didn't need to lift a hand. All I had to do was wait, as patiently as I had always waited, because time itself was my accomplice now, and it was finishing what I had begun. It began on a Monday morning, one of those gray mornings when the city seems to hold its breath, as though it already knows something is about to happen. The company had been wobbling for weeks, fissures spreading through its foundations like veins of rot beneath polished marble. But still he carried himself with the same swagger. Still she forced her brittle smile. Still the investors tried to convince themselves that everything was temporary, recoverable, nothing more than a bump in the road. They told themselves this because they needed to, because no one likes to admit they placed their faith in the wrong hands. But illusions have limits, and on that Monday morning, every illusion they clung to shattered at once. The news arrived in the form of an email, simple in its presentation, but devastating in its content. A major investor, one of the earliest, one who had once been the loudest cheerleader of their so-called leadership, had pulled out completely. Not just reducing their stake, not just pausing further funds, but pulling everything, demanding an exit, and doing so in a way that sent shockwaves through every other financial backer tied to the company. Within minutes, phones lit up, inboxes filled, meetings were hastily called. The panic spread faster than fire, because money is a language everyone understands. I wasn't in the building when it happened, of course. I didn't need to be. The collapse didn't require my presence, only my foresight. But I heard from whispers, from people still loyal to me in quiet ways, from the inevitable leaks that emerge when chaos begins. The meeting that morning had started with his usual performance, another attempt to smooth over the growing unease with charm and half-promises. She sat beside him, nodding, trying to radiate confidence she didn't possess, repeating lines he had fed her. And then the phones began buzzing, one after another, like alarm bells in a silent cathedral. The investor's withdrawal spread through the room like a sickness, and suddenly no one was listening to his speeches anymore. The floor fell out beneath them, and everyone could feel it. It wasn't just one investor. That was the spark, but sparks ignite fires. Others followed within hours. Contracts tied to me personally dissolved as the clauses I had set into place activated like tripwires. Suppliers cut ties, accounts froze, payments were rerouted, and worst of all for them, the news began to spread beyond boardrooms. Whispers among competitors, articles drafted in hushed tones by financial reporters hungry for scandal, rumors slipping into markets like shadows. The illusion of stability was gone. And once that illusion dies, so does everything built upon it. I can almost see the scene in my mind, even though I wasn't there. Him standing at the head of the table, his voice cracking for the first time as he tries to explain the inexplicable, her shifting uncomfortably in her seat, her hands tightening on the papers she no longer understands, the investors staring at them with growing disbelief, with anger, with betrayal of their own. Because betrayal is never one-sided. They had betrayed me, yes, but in doing so, they had also betrayed everyone who had believed in the company, and betrayal breeds rage. Investors do not forgive easily when their money disappears, when their pride is exposed as foolishness, when they realize they applauded the very people who led them into disaster. For him, I imagine the worst part was not the money itself, but the loss of control. He had always believed himself untouchable, the genius, the visionary, the one who could spin lies into gold with nothing more than a smile. But now the smile no longer worked. No amount of charm could unfreeze accounts. No amount of charisma could re-sign dissolved contracts. The power he had wielded so easily was gone, and in its place was the raw truth. He had never understood the structure he claimed to lead. He had thought removing me would simplify things, but in reality, he had removed the only person who knew how it all held together. For her, the collapse must have been even worse. She had stepped into my role believing it was an inheritance, a gift of power she had only to accept. But now the mask was slipping. She didn't know how to answer questions, didn't understand the systems crumbling around her, didn't have the credibility to face the storm. The investors looked at her and saw not strength but weakness, not a leader but a fraud. And perhaps in those moments, when panic painted the room in cold silence, she finally understood what she had done, that replacing me was never about competence, only betrayal, and betrayal cannot hold a company together. I was not there, but I didn't need to be to feel the ripple of their downfall. It reached me anyway, through texts from people who had once worked under me, through half-whispered stories that carried more satisfaction than any performance of revenge could ever bring. "It's falling apart," one message read. "They don't know what to do." Another said simply, "You were right." Those words, brief and to the point, were worth more than any applause. They were acknowledgement, validation, proof that the collapse I had engineered silently was unfolding exactly as I intended. The day of collapse was not marked by an explosion, not by a single catastrophic event, but by a chain reaction of failures, each one feeding the next until the structure they had paraded as invincible crumbled into dust. It was the day they realized that betrayal carries a cost, and that cost is always higher than expected. They had thought they had destroyed me. Instead, they had destroyed themselves. And I simply watched. From a distance, with the calm patience of someone who no longer needed to fight. The war had been won long before the first investor pulled out. The war had been won the moment he signed a contract without reading it. The moment she mistook imitation for power. The moment they believed I was gone when in truth, I was still woven into every corner of the company's foundation. Their downfall was not my doing in that moment. It was their own arrogance collapsing in on itself, a slow implosion dressed in the disguise of inevitability. That Monday morning marked the end of their illusion, but it was only the beginning of their ruin. The collapse of the company was not just financial, not just the unraveling of contracts and the evaporation of investor faith. but something deeper and more personal, a disintegration that began between the two people who had once smiled so confidently as they cast me aside. The cracks that had first appeared in boardrooms and on balance sheets soon spread into the very fabric of their relationship, turning their once smug alliance into a battlefield of accusations and suspicion. It was inevitable, of course. Their bond had never been built on loyalty or shared sacrifice. It had been built on betrayal, and betrayal is a foundation that cannot hold when the walls begin to crumble. I imagine the first fights began quietly, whispered arguments behind closed doors as they tried to make sense of the disaster unfolding around them. He, used to being adored for his charm, must have blamed her for failing to carry the role she had stolen. She, desperate to prove herself, must have accused him of being careless, of not seeing the danger, of not being as invincible as he had always pretended to be. At first, they probably told themselves it was stress, that every couple fights when under pressure, that the chaos would pass once they regained control. But there was no control left to regain, and the pressure was only beginning to mount. The investors turned cold, their once bright smiles replaced with cutting questions and veiled threats. Suppliers refused to answer calls. Staff, once loyal to the dream I had carried, began to leave quietly, slipping away before the ship sank completely. Every day brought a new failure, a new loss, a new reminder that they were in over their heads. And every new failure was another wedge driven between them. He accused her of not being strong enough, not being clever enough to handle the scrutiny. She accused him of arrogance, of ignoring details, of dismissing the very structures that had once held everything together. Their smiles, once practiced masks, became rarer, their voices sharper, their silences longer. It was a cruel kind of poetry to watch from afar, to see the same stage where they had humiliated me turn into the arena of their own implosion. They had thought themselves untouchable, partners in triumph, a power couple standing on the ashes of my sacrifice. But now they stood on ashes of their own making, choking on the smoke, clawing at each other as though blame could save them. And the investors, who had once cheered, now turned on them, whispering doubts, withdrawing funds, demanding answers they could not provide. Nothing unites traitors for long. Once the prize has slipped through their fingers, all that remains is resentment. Their implosion was not just professional, it was personal, raw, intimate. I heard from those who still spoke to me quietly that the arguments became loud, public even. That in meetings he would cut her off, his voice laced with frustration, while she shot back with venom of her own. That in hallways staff could hear doors slamming, words spat like daggers, silences so thick they suffocated the air. She had thought replacing me would bring her the satisfaction of belonging, but instead, it brought her the endless torment of being blamed for failures she could never hope to fix. He had thought removing me would leave him free, untethered, powerful, but instead it left him naked, exposed, revealed as a man who had never understood the machinery he claimed to lead. And beneath it all was the unspoken truth they could not face. They had built their triumph on betrayal, and betrayal breeds nothing but ruin. There was no love left between them, only the memory of love twisted into resentment. She began to doubt him, perhaps even to hate him, for dragging her into a storm she could not weather. He began to despise her, perhaps even more than he despised me, for failing to play the role of savior in the mess he had created. And all the while, the world around them closed in, contracts dissolving, investors fleeing, their names whispered not with admiration, but with scorn. I didn't need to lift a hand to destroy them. They destroyed each other. That was the beauty of betrayal. It carries within it the seed of self-destruction. They had watered that seed the moment they smiled at each other across the table while casting me aside, and now it grew into a poison that consumed them from the inside out. What had once been their alliance became their undoing. Every word became an accusation. Every silence became an indictment. Every look became a reminder of the lies they had told not just to me, but to themselves. From triumph to desperation, that was their arc. The investors who had once toasted their brilliance now avoided their calls. The employees who had once endured out of loyalty to the dream now slipped away without looking back. The media, once flattering, began to sharpen its teeth, eager for a scandal, eager to expose the couple who had risen so quickly only to fall even faster. and within the four walls of their once proud office, the two of them stood not as partners, but as enemies, clinging to the shards of their illusion, while blaming each other for every cut. Their implosion was inevitable, and I knew it from the moment I walked out of that boardroom in silence. Betrayal may bring temporary triumph, but it never brings peace. It corrodes everything it touches, even the bond between those who conspire together. They had thought they had won. They had thought they had erased me, but in the end, they were the ones erased, not by my hand, but by the very poison they had chosen to drink. And I watched the implosion unfold from a distance, calm, patient, detached, not with glee, not with pity, but with the cold satisfaction of someone who knew that justice had finally caught up to them. Their desperation was not mine to savor, it was theirs to endure. And endure it they did, until there was nothing left between them but the ashes of betrayal and the silence of a dream, destroyed. By the time the last curtain fell, their world was no longer a stage but a ruin. The applause they once drank like wine, silenced into a void they could not escape. The company that had been their crown jewel was nothing but an empty shell, contracts torn, funds frozen, trust obliterated. The implosion of their relationship had already begun before the final blow landed, but the true destruction came when consequences, the kind that cannot be denied, negotiated, or charmed away, arrived at their door. The law, the creditors, the media, all converged on the carcass of what they once pretended was invincible. And in that convergence, their humiliation was sealed. It started with lawsuits. Investors who had lost fortunes demanded recompense, pointing fingers at the very couple who had promised them brilliance. Suppliers filed claims for broken agreements. Employees sought damages for the chaos and unpaid wages. The web of betrayal untangled in courts where charm meant nothing and only facts mattered. For the first time in his life, he could not talk his way out, could not smile into forgiveness, could not perform his way into salvation. His arrogance dissolved under the fluorescent lights of legal proceedings, his voice no longer smooth but cracked, his shoulders no longer broad with confidence, but slumped with the weight of failure. He had always loved the spotlight, but now the spotlight burned him. For her, the humiliation was sharper still. She had wanted my place, had worn it like a mask, had convinced herself that betrayal could transform her into me. But the public eye does not forgive masks. It sees through them, strips them away until only the bare skin of fraud remains. The newspapers called her an opportunist. The blogs painted her as the traitor who had conspired to destroy. The whispers in circles where reputation is currency turned her name into poison. She had thought taking my role would make her powerful, but in the end it made her infamous. A warning told in hushed tones of what happens when ambition feeds on betrayal. And as for me, I did not need to lift a single hand to deliver that final blow. It had been written long before, in the contracts, in the structures, in the foresight that had protected me even when I was blind with trust. My silence in that boardroom had been the first stone cast, my patience the shield that let time itself deliver the justice I no longer had to chase. They collapsed because they had cut out the heart of what kept the company alive, and then they turned on each other because betrayal does not sustain, it consumes. All I had to do was step aside and let their arrogance eat them alive. But this story is not only about their ruin, it is also about my liberation. For years I had chained myself to their vision, to the weight of responsibility, to the endless sacrifices I told myself were necessary for love and loyalty. For years, I had carried them on my back, believing that if I just gave enough of myself, we would succeed together. It took betrayal to strip me of that illusion, to free me from the lie that my value was tied to their approval. When the company fell, when their reputations burned, when their triumph turned to ash, I did not feel loss. I felt release. I walked away from the wreckage with nothing material from them, but with something far more powerful: clarity. I was no longer bound by a dream poisoned at its roots. I was no longer beholden to a man who mistook my silence for weakness, or to a friend who turned my trust into a weapon. I was free, and freedom has a taste sharper than revenge. Yes, I had orchestrated their downfall. Yes, I had ensured they paid the price of their betrayal. But what mattered more was that I was no longer trapped in their shadow. I had survived, endured, and emerged stronger, not because of them, but in spite of them. Their end came quietly, after all the noise. Bank accounts drained, reputations shredded. Their names no longer whispered in admiration but spat with scorn. They faded into obscurity, two figures bound together not by love or power, but by the memory of their shared failure. They had wanted everything at my expense. In the end, they were left with nothing at all. And I, the woman they thought they had erased, walked into a future untethered, carrying only the knowledge that betrayal does not define me. My resilience does. That is the truth of the final blow. It wasn't just the lawsuits, the financial collapse, the media frenzy. It wasn't just the humiliation or the implosion of their relationship. The real final blow was the revelation that I no longer needed to fight them, no longer needed to prove myself to anyone. They had tried to take my place, to strip me of worth, to cast me aside as if I were nothing. But their betrayal had only uncovered what had always been there: my strength, my foresight, my ability to survive the storm and walk away whole. So when I look back now, I do not see loss. I see liberation. I see a woman who gave everything, who was betrayed, who was humiliated, and who chose silence not as surrender, but as strategy. I see a woman who watched her betrayers destroy themselves without lifting a finger, and I see a woman who walked away, not broken, not bitter, but free. That is my ending, not their ruin, though it came, not their humiliation, though it was deserved, but my liberation. My triumph was not in their destruction. It was in reclaiming myself from the ashes.